Welcome back, UF 100 history fans. So this is going to be our next video to cover some, not all, of the elements that we've been working on to this point in UF 100. So you can see with this graphic, when we started weeks ago, there were numerous things that we were tasked in this University Foundations course to cover. But now we're trying to narrow our focus, and our focus is going to be on those four things that are still in front of us. So that doesn't mean that what we had covered previously is of no significance, but what it does mean is we're trying to find a way to streamline and to bring this course to a successful conclusion, because we understand that for a lot of students, life's just kind of been thrown up in the air. So with that in mind, let's see if we can just focus on what's in front of us. And what's in front of us is the remaining 45% of the course grade. So what we're trying to do is to split this up so we can approach this strategically. In discussion groups with Emily, you've been working and will continue to work on developing your solo teaching moment on the identity variable that you selected. And also, you'll be working together as a team, serving as teachers in this sense as well, to teach a little bit about Boise's early history, and also for the Ethnic Streetscape project. So that's what we're going to focus on in discussion groups on Fridays. But here for our plenary, when we used to meet on Tuesday, I'll be taking advantage of this time together to continue to set up what we're going to use for our second and final exam, and then also the final solo identity project. So in discussion group, you've had a chance to individually as well as a team focus on various elements, one of which that you touched on in discussion group was that metaphor of the cultural iceberg. So I'm going to be making use of that as well to illustrate some of the things we're going to be developing here on this side of the ledger. But this can be a great means of providing some substance both to the solo teaching moment that you'll have for your identity variable, as well as team teaching, because bottom line, most everyone can see what's above the surface. So that's why we want to challenge you to go beyond just that and also include some elements of what's more deep, or oftentimes can be referred to as invisible elements for the identity variable as well as the ethnic streetscape. So we're going to look to incorporate some of that here as well. So what we're going to cover with this week's narrated PowerPoint, as well as next week, is going to culminate in our second and final exam. Then following that, I'll have another narrated PowerPoint, and we're going to circle back and pick up where we had left off, those who came to see me earlier in the semester when we had our discussion about the core identity project. So we'll have one narrated PowerPoint that's going to help hopefully develop that and facilitate you for that last submission. But what we have to stay focused on what's in front of us, what's going to come up first is going to be on April 21st, the take-home exam. So that exam will be posted, as you can see here, the Monday before. So on the 20th, it'll be pushed out by noon on that Monday. So you're going to have 24 hours to develop your response. You'll write it up in a Microsoft Word document and then upload it to Blackboard. So this video and the one that will follow will continue to develop, therefore, the content that you'll need for this last exam. So today's focus for the second exam is going to be on the red box, and we're going to be taking a look now at the role of the scientific revolution, oftentimes referred to it as a revolution because of the profound changes. And then also what was revolutionary was now the expansion or the exploration of Europeans who approximately 5 centuries ago would leave their Western European homelands and now begin to move out and find what was for them new places on planet Earth. So the first exam we had, the format when we were all together in our regular normal mode, that was a blue book exam. So we're not going to be using a blue book, and instead the format we'll use for this second exam, we're going to just move it over and ask you to write your response in Microsoft Word. And again, you'll have 24 hours to develop this. The videos will remain in place, so you can go back and consult those as you wish. Also, as we speak about going back, what's going to help us now in our discussion for this segment is to harken back to our History Journal 9.2 when we were looking at the importance for historians of assessing continuity and change in history. It's one of several key elements that historians are tasked with, not the only, but that's going to serve as our focus, the challenge that historians have in explaining well, why it is that things change over time, and then for that matter, why some things remain the same. So this is where we pick up the story previously. All early human societies that we know about, identity was primarily given. You were either born to your position in life, or the tribe, the ethnic group would define one's identity. The family would convey a sense of identity. But what we're trying to understand is how our society historically went from one where it was predominantly focused on a given identity that then shifted to a chosen identity. So as we saw back in 9.2, this is the historical development that we will be focusing on for the purposes of this take-home 24-hour exam. For us, the specific development is from given to chosen identity and how this represents one of the biggest changes in human history. And your task will be for this take-home exam to explain to someone outside of this class, so it makes sense, how did that happen? How did our society go from sharing in common with all other traditional societies, the focus more so on the community, to one that I refer to now as an I society? Now, do keep in mind for clarity, it's not 100% and 0%. Traditional societies did allow a degree, as we saw in the previous slides, for chosen identity, but that was more limited. But I think most of us can recognize in our society today the importance, the emphasis that's been placed on the individual and the choices that many of us can now make. So to put this in a broader context for our History Journal 23.0, we want to look now in a broader sense at what we can refer to now as individualism and the West. And what we're going to be looking at now are some aspects of Western civilization. Now, I didn't want to assume too much because some of you, though not all, may have taken some previous history courses, or you've been engaged in conversations where people make reference to what we call the West or Western civilization. But make sure as we move forward on this, we want everyone to be at least essentially on the same page. We want to take some time now to explore what exactly people mean when they say the West or Western civilization. Now, this, of course, is a far more in-depth discussion. You can take whole courses on Western civilization. This is an image from a textbook that covers this. Sometimes, if you can make it out at the very top, this is the combined volume. But sometimes the course will be divided into 2 semesters instead of just 1. And it's something, therefore, that could take 15 to 30 weeks to cover. But for us, we're going to just narrow our focus to identify some distinguishing elements. So we have clarity going forward so we can explain to others outside of this class. When we speak about individualism and the West, well, what exactly is the West and what's being referred to? So one of the first things we want to keep in mind when we speak about what we call the West or Western civilization is that it has this static as well as dynamic. Both of these components are operative at the same time. Real quick, so we don't get lost in the jargon, static essentially means things that remain the same. So there are some key elements when we speak of Western civilization that have remained the same over time, but then there are also dynamic or elements that have changed and continue to change. Now, as we look back to try to kind of get a handle on what is the timeline, what it is that we're talking about when we speak of the West or Western civilization, and where do we locate this on a map in terms of geography? In many early textbooks about Western civilization, one of the first starting points, not in all of them, but a good many of them, they'll usually use approximately 10,000 years ago. And 10,000 years ago, when we speak about Western civilization, on the map, in terms of where, it references, therefore, ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. So I think many of us, we've seen images of the pyramids of ancient Egypt, etc. This is the when and the where that oftentimes begins a discussion of Western civilization. But keep in mind that Western civilization, in terms of when and where, is dynamic. So that means it keeps changing. So let's look at another significant change. If you move a little closer now to our own time, approximately 2,500 years ago, well, when we speak about the West, we're not talking so much now about ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt anymore. Instead, the focus now moves on the map to ancient Greece. But then that too is dynamic. Then bring it to 2,000 years ago, and now the focus has shifted from ancient Greece to ancient Rome. And it stays dynamic. If you go 1,000 years ago, now the focus has shifted, if you will, to what today we refer to as Western Europe. And if we go to 500 years ago and when you speak about the West and Western civilization, then it comes a lot closer to where we are on the map, to the Caribbean. This 500 years ago, this is a reference, of course, to the voyages, for example, of Christopher Columbus. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Approximately 500 years ago, now the West we see showing up in parts of what will later be referred to as the Americas. So this is what's referenced when we say that it's dynamic, when we speak about the when and the where of the West or Western civilization. Now today, when we oftentimes refer to the West or Western civilization, generally what a good many people mean when they say that, they're talking about Europe, well, more accurately, Western Europe, good portions of the Americas, as well as Australia and New Zealand. And the reason, of course, that the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand become involved in this is because of European expansion that we'll explore in more detail here momentarily. But let's also keep in mind the dynamic nature of the West and Western civilization. So, is South Africa considered the West or a part of Western civilization? Well, it can be yes and no, depending on the criteria that you would use to define what it means to be of the West. What does it mean to define Western civilization? The same question can be asked about Brazil in South America. Is Brazil part of Western civilization? And for that matter, the same question can be posed, well, is Japan part of the West? I mean, they're making automobiles, amazing advances in technology. The automobile was invented in the West. And now Japan has the world's largest automotive company with Toyota. So does Japan now count as the West? And the last graphic on the right in that image, that's of Russia. Can Russia be considered part of the West? Well, elements of South Africa, Brazil, Japan, Russia could be put in the context of being characteristic of the West or Western civilization. But almost as easily, we could say that some characteristics are very specific just to those areas. So the West, therefore, remains very dynamic. And different parts of the world have embraced aspects of what we refer to as the West or Western civilization. Now, the dynamic element continues when we now speak about, well, who exactly are we talking about? What kind of people are being talked about when we say the West or Western civilization? Well, as we saw there earlier, if we went back about, say, 2,500 years, when we said the West, the who that was being talked about was the people of ancient Greece. And here we have one example of this from the city state of Athens, the noted philosophers of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So 2,500 years ago, when we would say the West or Western civilization, these are the people that we would be talking about. Now, this leads into what today is a oftentimes controversial or debated topic. So, is Western civilization just about white people? Well, 2,500 years ago, I guess, well, we can say that Plato, Aristotle, Socrates were white in a sense. But remember, in ancient Greece, they probably had pretty good tans. So this, of course, is something discussion for another day, something that you could explore more in depth. But generally, oftentimes, historically, what is referenced when we talk about the people, it is a reference to people that are characterized as being white or Caucasian. But we just had 8 years of President Obama as president of the United States, and the United States is largely considered part of the West or Western civilization. So that's our example of the dynamic element. Yes, in time and place, when we were speaking about the West, we were speaking about specific groups of people. But today, when we speak about the West, former President Barack Obama is every bit as Western as any other recent president. Now, when we speak about aspects of Western civilization, we speak about it in the same sense that we would if we were to define aspects of Islamic or the civilization of the Middle East. So we might use many of the same criteria, but then as we start to delve into it in more detail, we see different distinguishing and in some instances even unique elements that can define be it Islamic civilization or Western civilization. But what I want to point to is this question you saw now on the screen. And this was a question that was asked of me some years ago when I was teaching courses in Western civilization at San Diego State University. One of my colleagues stopped by one day, and there at the door, we were having a conversation, and he had asked me, "So, what classes are you teaching this semester?" And one class that I pointed to that I was teaching was Western civilization. And immediately, his response was, "Are they still teaching that?" See, here in what we refer to as the West or Western civilization, in some ways, we have kind of an identity crisis. See, here, many of these, what are now former courses in Western civilization, many of them have been replaced with courses in world history instead of the history of just the West. Now, what makes it peculiar or what connects it with an identity crisis of sorts is really only here in the West do some people pretend that there is no real such thing as Western civilization, or we wouldn't really, or we really shouldn't be just having classes on the West or Western civilization. Now, this is mighty peculiar. It's peculiar because the rest of the world knows there's a West. So if you live in parts of the Islamic world, there is, and you believe you understand and can recognize Western civilization because it's different than yours. If you live in Japan, you're cognizant, therefore, of your own history, Japanese civilization, but they are very much aware of what we would refer to as Western civilization. And here you can see in these graphics, there's been a lot of folks who have tried, therefore, to identify distinguishing elements. Of course, things that are shared in common by all civilizations, elements that are shared in common by all cultures. But there are, as you come to know more about these distinctive civilizations, elements that help to distinguish and define them. So in this graphic there on the left, you can see historically elements that many people take as defining Asian, in contrast to Western values. And the one, of course, I wanted to draw your attention to is the first one there, the emphasis on the community of Asian values versus, as we're explaining, the emergence of the emphasis on the individual. And the same you can see in this second graphic there at the top, the emphasis on the individual contrasted with the emphasis on the collective or the group. So what we're trying to do and explain what is the West, what is Western civilization, we're trying to find what we've referenced in this course and discussed in discussion group as well, identity markers. That's what we're asking you, for example, for your team project, to try to find some elements that are, of course, visible on the surface. And there's the same graphic that we've been using. We saw, for example, on the Bass block, how the Bass flag was used to decorate, to symbolically designate the block, the colors of that flag, red, white, and green, and how even the concrete, the streetscape was done up in those colors. So those are examples of surface or visible identity markers. But we want to challenge you when you do your solo identity variable project and your team project, and here too, as we explore the West and Western civilization, to also go below the surface to the deep or sometimes invisible aspects of identity. And we want to apply that now to aspects of Western civilization. Because what is oftentimes invisible and what we can refer to as being a deep culture are a group's or a culture's values. They are not necessarily apparent when you first encounter these people. After time and getting to know maybe some people from this part of the world in time and place, you come to understand that different groups emphasize and prioritize different values. So historically, as we look at aspects of Western civilization, we need to keep in mind that there are some key elements of Western civilization that are not universal in origin. Some things that we refer to as the West or Western civilization derived in just this civilization. Hence, it was not universal. It didn't pop up in all civilizations, in all cultures, in the same time, in the same place, and the same way. Our Western origins, many people trace back to Athens and Jerusalem. I noted earlier the ancient Greek city-state of Athens, and that now coupled with the Judeo-Christian tradition. Judeo-Christian, the fusion of Jewish ideas and values with Christian ideas and values. If you were there, many elements of Christianity, of course, share their origins in the religion of Judaism. But you take that tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that's what's designated by the reference to Jerusalem, a holy city for the Jews and a holy city, of course, for Christians as well. So this hybrid of Athens and Jerusalem serves as kind of this unique place, the origins of what we refer to, therefore, as Western civilization. Now, note, as we continue this discussion, in no way are we trying to denigrate any other civilization. Earlier, we had the graphic of Islamic civilization, Asian civilizations. What we're trying to understand are just some defining elements, some of those deep or invisible aspects of what we talk about when we say Western civilization. And lo and behold, one of those distinctive, if not unique, elements of Western civilization is the emphasis placed on the individual. Now, that's not the only element. Much more time and discussion for another day could explore in more detail other values that also define Western civilization. But for our purposes, for our discussion today, as we go forward to narrow our focus, we want to understand how and why it was that it was in the Western world that we began to see this transition, the emergence, the greater emphasis placed on individualism. Now, what we want to keep in mind is that these Western values remain dynamic. So, case in point that we see here, many of these values have changed over time. and many of them remain fiercely contested today. So here's an image, as you can make out here. Did we vote on your marriage? The context of this image goes back to the definition, what should be the legal definition of marriage. Historically in the West, like all other traditional societies, the definition of marriage had been between a man and a woman. But as many of you know, and here's an example of a dynamic value, how the definition of marriage was recently changed. So the values of the West do not remain static. They don't necessarily remain fixed. There are elements of Western civilization that remain dynamic over time. And that's why we refer now to this graphic. What we're trying to make sense of, and for the purposes of the exam, what you're trying to explain to someone outside of this class, how do you account for this radical departure where every other society, civilization, had emphasized the community? What is it about the West in general? And then we'll look specifically now to the scientific revolution and expansion in this discussion that contributed to the emphasis on the individual. So the first of our two for this discussion, we're going to be taking a look now at how modern science contributed to the rise of individualism. So that'll serve as our History Journal prompt 23.1. Again, science is a characteristic of Western civilization. It is not necessarily unique to the West. Other civilizations also manifested aspects of science. But what we're speaking about is a more narrowed focus, what it is about modern science in the West and how that contributed to the rise of individualism. So when we speak about the West, for the purposes of our discussion in this narrated PowerPoint, we're going to be focusing on how the West influenced two events that for many go under the title of the Enlightenment as well as secular humanism. So we're going to have an opportunity here to see how modern science informed these distinct outlooks. Both the Enlightenment and secular humanism would share some things in common. But when we speak of modern science, we're not going to be speaking about the periodic table. We're not going to be drilling down and exploring the contribution of scientists. As you can see here in the graphic there in the lower left, that's a graphic of Isaac Newton. Our discussion is going to be less so about these significant scientists, but more so about how their scientific ideas contributed now to the Enlightenment and secular humanism. Because it will be these two elements that will go to produce a change in thinking, a shift from the emphasis on the community to that of the individual. All right, so let's take a look now how the Enlightenment and secular humanism draw much of its influence from modern science. Okay, so again, to keep this in context, previously we had covered how both the Renaissance and the Reformation had contributed to the shift from given to chosen identity. So we're going to focus now on science, and then we'll follow up with exploration. So to identify when we're talking about, when we're referencing the scientific revolution, we're going to focus our discussion in the time span from about the 1500s to the 1700s. In some ways, we are still undergoing a scientific revolution. All right, but we're going to focus, if you will, on this earlier segment, and we'll have a chance to see how the ideas, perhaps you've heard of some of these scientists, the ideas of Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, I just referenced Newton, how their ideas would now begin to inform a new understanding, and how that new understanding would produce an emphasis on the individual. So this is our time span, 1500s to about the 1700s. And when we speak about the scientific revolution, as you can read here, what we want to focus on is how it changed the way people thought about the world. More specifically, how people thought about the world in terms about the community to the individual. There's no doubt the appeal of science. Since the early period of the scientific revolution, many people were drawn to what scientists were doing because, in many ways, it gave us power over nature. Well, as it happened, we had a rude awakening just last week when we had the second largest earthquake of recent times here in the state of Idaho. In those seconds, those of you who felt that earthquake, you were reminded that we don't control nature. See, but this is the power that science has provided us. We can actually convince ourselves in many ways that we have this incredible power over nature. Hence, then and now, science has maintained this. And that power comes from the ability of science to provide us with degrees of certainty and answers to our questions. Where it becomes most tangible, though, is in applied science. And that, of course, is technology. See, we recognize and we're drawn to the appeal of modern science and technology because we love things like air conditioning. See, this gives us power over nature. We love things like the smartphone. This too provides us, if you will, with access, unprecedented access actually, to answers via elements like Google, etc. So then and now, science has always had a huge appeal. But again, what we want to focus on is how science now will inform what we talk about when we reference this era known as the Age of Enlightenment, and what we mean when we say secular humanism. Here you have a working definition of what we talk about when we reference secular humanism. Because it will be secular humanism that will contribute, if you will, to the emphasis on the individual. So our working definition, as you can see here, is in regard to the particular belief that humanity is capable of morality and self-fulfillment. Hence, self-fulfillment. Underscore that because there's the emphasis on the individual, self-fulfillment. And it's closely followed with this notion without belief in God. So here you have on the bottom left a variation of our nation's motto, "In God We Trust." But under secular humanism, this now becomes optional. You can take it or leave it. In God we trust. Maybe yes, maybe no. And the graphic there on the bottom right, you have that image of one of the ongoing themes for a good many folks today, this ongoing perceived battle between science and religion. For some, they believe it's a 500-year war that is still being fought. Others have reconciled this. I've never said that science and religion were at war with one another. They've found ways, if you will, to reconcile both what science and religion brings together. But no doubt there's been this ongoing tension for some between these two sources of truth. We had a chance to see that previously when we discussed the role of the Protestant Reformation and how that contributed to the rise of individualism. If you recall there in our graphic, we've got Martin Luther. Initially, he sought to reform or make changes in the Roman Catholic Church of the time. But then when that failed, he moved to a more radical stage where he wanted now to eliminate, to do away with the Roman Catholic Church. And that's the image that we have there in the middle. And that's personified by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. So we saw how in the Reformation, though it wasn't necessarily his intent, Martin Luther contributed to the shift from the emphasis on the community to that of the individual. Because, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church, there was a layer between you, the individual, and God. And that mediary, communal element was the church. It wasn't his intent, but we'll see something similar now with secular humanism. When you place more of an emphasis on what it is that individuals can do, It contributes, therefore, to the emphasis of the individual versus emphasizing the community. So secular humanism will be empowered by much of the early work that was done by the early scientists. And it was pretty impressive what many of these early scientists were able to accomplish. And this is what gave many this belief that individuals were able to accomplish great things. It has given us power over nature. And what the scientific revolution has provided us is arguably one of the largest self-esteem movements known to human history. So you have the graphic there in the bottom right. Repeat after me. I can do this. Science has empowered us to take significant control over nature. So for example, one of the most populated places in our country is Southern California. Well, without science and modern technology, that would not be the case. If you're not aware of Southern California, it's a desert. And it cannot sustain that many people living in that place because, for starters, there's just not enough water. See, but this is an example of how now science, and then more specifically applied science, gave us this power over nature. Because of things like the California aqueduct, now people can live in that part of the world in much greater volume. See, but this now gives individuals an incredible sense that I can do this. Humans now will experience collectively a self-esteem movement, thanks to the contributions of early modern science. It will be this same confidence that will now be transmitted to a period that we call in history the Enlightenment, oftentimes also referred to as the Age of Reason. So what we're talking about is now the 17th and 18th centuries. So that's where we are on the timeline. So when we speak now about the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, here too we begin to see this confidence that emerges, the confidence in the individual. What led to the Enlightenment? It's not a simple or single dynamic. All right. So in the same way, when we speak about how do we explain that our society went from the emphasis on the community to that of the individual, there is no single event. It is a complex story. Well, the same applies here to an extent with the Enlightenment. So you can see here some of the points that we had touched on earlier. The Renaissance contributed to this sense of humanism as well, and that humanism also influences this sense of what the individual can achieve. The Reformation, on the right side of this image, also influenced, though it was not the intent of the Reformation founders, the early reformers, but they too placed the individual in a far more central position. Now we want to focus on how the scientific revolution, and here in the Age of Reason, what it is that we can now know, how collectively this now creates this greater sense of optimism of what the individual can accomplish, what the individual can know. Now, there are numerous Enlightenment values. We saw earlier when we touched upon Western civilization, I just focused on one of the numerous values that were listed there. So we're going to do the same thing here as we're looking at the Enlightenment, because again, the Enlightenment is a subject for its own potential course. We could take 15 weeks analyzing various aspects of the Enlightenment. But again, we're just trying to focus on how the Enlightenment contributed to the emergence or the emphasis on the individual. What we need to keep in mind, though, when we speak about the Enlightenment, just to have this for our context, since we had spoken about text, context, and subtext, the text that we can all see is the word enlightenment. All right, but we need to appreciate for context that it's not a neutral label. So when we speak of the Enlightenment, as we saw earlier, we're just speaking about just a few centuries ago when new ways of thinking begins to emerge. Well, For the context, we can now transition to the subtext as well. See, before the Enlightenment, well, what do we call that period? Well, some folks may use neutral labels and call it the medieval period, the Middle Ages, but some instead will prefer to use a more provocative title like the Dark Ages. So there you have it. See, when you call this period the Enlightenment, well, that says once you pick up the story, this refers to the people, therefore, who catch a clue, who see the light, shall we speak. So if you're not careful for the context and the subtext, that means everyone who lived before the Enlightenment, therefore, didn't have a clue. They were essentially in the dark. So it's very self-serving when you refer to this movement as the Enlightenment, because you're pretty much just saying those of us who see the world this way, well, we're enlightened. And if you don't see it that way, of course, then you are the opposite of that, and you must inhabit, therefore, the Dark Ages. So do keep in mind when we speak about the Enlightenment, it's a loaded label. All right, so do note that for the text, the context, and the subtext. I also want to ground this in what we had a chance to discuss before. I used this when we spoke about Anthony Croman. We had this as an example of a crap test. So here, once again, we see the three phases of the university. So here, what we're looking at, we can see that transition. The age of secular humanism is what we had listed, and now I'm trying to provide a bit more context for what it was that I was pointing to at that time, because the characteristic of the modern university, we know truth, objective truth, via science. And this is the confidence now that undergirds the Enlightenment and secular humanism. So we have spoken about truth in this course. In particular, I spoke about the four truths of history, where we had normative truth, what a group decides is true. We spoke about objective truth. This is truth outside of you, okay? Because objective truth we can contrast with subjective truth, because you, the subject, now decide what is truth. And last but not least, we also spoke about complex truth. So we've discussed aspects or various elements of truth before, but what we're focusing on now is how objective truth was now transitioning. So we saw in the previous slide here, from the 12th century forward, objective truth came from religion. But now what we see emerging in the modern university was objective truth coming from science. So we went, therefore, from truth coming from the men in red robes to those with white lab coats. So I don't want to lose you here with the examples that I'm using. The image there at the top left, the red robes, this is a reference to the cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church, the hierarchy. Versus then, in contrast, we have the white robe, and of course nowadays, when you go to the hospital, we have all these different colors. You got baby blue, and you have light green. But of course, what we're referencing when we speak about white lab coats, that becomes now the symbol of the scientist. So what we're speaking about, therefore, is where do we go to find truth? And it was modern science that now empowered many to believe that we could find truth in the movement that we referred to as the Enlightenment, and what we also refer to as secular humanism. And that's what provides the context of what we had touched on earlier. Those of you who came to the office hour, well, when we still could meet in person, when we were speaking about setting up the Core Identity Project, you'll hopefully recall this graphic that we spoke about. But now, hopefully, this is providing some more context where this is coming from. On the right, you had, if you will, the Christian worldview. The source of truth emanated, therefore, from the Bible. See, but in secular humanism, the Bible is no longer the source of truth. So in secular humanism, we have an alternative source of truth. Now, the key element here, though, on the left with secular humanism, the mind of man guides morality. So there on the bottom left, there you see an emphasis on the individual. Now, this is not to argue that Christianity does not have a key role for the individual. It does. But what we're trying to understand now is how science contributed to this as well. We saw how the Protestant Reformation contributed to the rise of individualism, but here we wanted to appreciate how modern science contributed to this as well. And it was via secular humanism and the Enlightenment that we would see over a span of centuries the shift from the emphasis on the community to the emphasis on the individual, because it was now via modern science that key individuals, Newton, Galileo, later Einstein, that they were able to accomplish significant gains in what it is that we could know and how we could gain power over nature, and how through modern science and these scientists we can live vicariously through them. So it was via secular humanism and the Enlightenment that we also can help to explain how we shifted from the community to the emphasis on the individual. So that's our focus for how science contributed to this transformation. Now we want to pivot and take a look at Western expansion and the rise of individual identity. So here I wanted to pick up on earlier, I made the reference to the little diddly that we have, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So what we're going to be looking at now are the consequences as people of Western Europe now begin to leave their homeland and begin to expand and explore what to them, to that point, were unknown parts of the rest of the world. So, again, for the wider context, we've touched on how the Renaissance and the Reformation can help us to understand this shift from given to chosen identity. We looked at how science contributed to secular humanism, as well as the Enlightenment that empowered the individual. Now we want to see how expansion also contributes to this transition. All right, so as we pick up our story as Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, the spot on the map that we're looking at, I now have this image with the red circle around it, is of Western Europe. All right, so that's the then that we're talking about. Because, again, remember that geographically, the West is not static, it's dynamic. All right, so in modern times, starting 5 centuries ago, we will now begin to see how parts of Western civilization will literally be transplanted to other parts of the world. So I think many of us are familiar with New England. All right, so here essentially you have the transplanting of elements of English society in other parts of the world. Many of us, I think, have also heard of Nuevo España or Nouveau France. The same thing. We now have people of Spanish descent transplanting elements of their society here in the Americas, the French, etc. All right, so again, keep in mind this static and dynamic element as we move from then to now when we speak about expansion. All right, so again, to tie in with what we had touched on earlier when we had the conversation about how the Renaissance contributed to the rise of individualism, one of the key elements that we saw and discussed in terms of the Renaissance was the emergence of private space, the room. And that's when we, if you recall, I touched on at that time, here is in the bottom left a log cabin. So what's characteristic of a log cabin is when you go through that door, if you've never had a chance to actually visit one, there are no walls. All cabins, essentially, they're just 4 walls because there's just one room. One of the key elements to conceive of ourselves as an individual is to have a sense of private space. So we contrast that now with a private room in a hospital. So that's the image there on the top right. So that's what the Renaissance helped to make possible. This notion of private space would contribute, therefore, to the emphasis on the individual. Now we want to, if you will, lay that alongside how the Europeans, as they begin to leave their Western European homeland, would now also contribute to this transition and the rise of individualism. On this graphic, we see you can make out the early voyages of Christopher Columbus. So from Western Europe, and Columbus sailed from Spain. He was sponsored by Spain for these voyages. He traveled, and many people of that time of Western Europe referred to it as the Old World once they discovered what was for them the New World. Now, keeping in mind when I say for them, because as I think most of us know, in the New World, when the Europeans arrived, there were already people living there. The indigenous population, which Columbus took to call Indians, because he mistakenly believed he found what he was looking for. What Columbus was looking for was what was referred to as the Indies, what today we would call, well, India, Indonesia, China. That was the collective name 5 centuries ago for what Columbus was looking for. So when he was following his plan to sail west to go east, he insisted he found what he was looking for, because people knew that, well, they had encountered these people who lived on these islands. So Columbus thought he'd found what he was looking for. Only later would people of Western Europe now come to explain this as a contrast between the Old World and what was for them the New World. But what Western expansion, as well as modern science, represents is an opportunity for a segment of the world's population to escape what we can refer to as mental constraints. So, no, one of the things we're always asking you to take into consideration is the use of analytical frameworks. That's how we try to take information and create knowledge. So, an analytical framework we want to keep in mind for our analysis here is that of mental constraints. See, because modern science allowed us to escape a very narrow understanding of how nature functioned. That's the power of modern science. We were able to escape those mental constraints. And that referenced how the scientific revolution allowed people to understand the world a different way. Well, European expansion also allowed now this segment of humanity to escape the mental constraints of how big they thought the world was. Because for 5 centuries ago, the people who inhabited Western Europe, they knew about Western Europe, and they also knew that on the other side of the continent was China. So they were cognizant. People knew, therefore, that there were people on this continent, but they did not know that the Western Hemisphere existed. Quick footnote, some earlier Europeans did know this. One group, they were the Vikings. They knew there was another land that later we would call the Americas. But for all intents and purposes, when Columbus now ignites this era of expansion and exploration for Western Europeans, most Europeans did not know that the Western Hemisphere existed. So this, again, would allow Westerners to escape mental constraints for how big this world actually was. The world that the Europeans knew 5 centuries ago, the constraints, the mental constraints that they knew, you can see with this graphic. Pay particular attention to all the different colors. See, those colors represent, in a way, mental constraints. This is one of the most divided places on planet Earth 500 years ago. So there, we can take a look what is today Spain. Spain is all not one color. We have multiple colors. Today, what we refer to as France, if you can make it out there, there's various shades of purple there. It's not a consistent color. And in particular, when you go to what today we call Germany and Italy, there too we have all of these different colors. So the old world constraints in terms of the mental outlook was far more constrained or limited 5 centuries ago. This is what expansion blows wide open, because it will now allow Europeans to understand their community in a different way and then emphasize the individual. Again, there is no one fixed moment. I've made reference to Columbus's voyage in 1492 and his other earlier voyages. I also referenced that even before Columbus, we now know that the folks that we refer to as the Vikings were in parts of what today we call the Americas, specifically parts of what is today northeast Canada. But not to make 1492 all of a sudden this magic moment, we can actually also identify the year 1215 as being a key historical moment, specifically how this moment influenced the history of England. And then over time, how this English idea would go on to influence the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Italians, etc. This moment of 1215 is what we refer to as the Magna Carta. As you can read, if you haven't already there in the graphic, do want to underscore some of these key elements, the big takeaways from the Magna Carta of 1215, and how it initially would begin to change how the English would perceive themselves and the individual, and then by extension, later, how their neighbors would incorporate this. Note in that second statement, it gave the power to people and made the king responsible to look after the best interests of the people and not just look after himself. This gave rulers restrictions. This imposed rules on the community so that the individual might be able to do more things. So we have this in 1215 in the case of early English history. And then over time, what was initially the power to the people, well, that people, what's referenced in 1215, those were fellow nobles. So in the graphic there on the top right, that's King John, who essentially was made to sign the Magna Carta. And the people who made him were fellow English lords or nobles. So power doesn't go to the common person in England in 1215. That will come much later. But it's important to recognize the Magna Carta because it helps plant the seeds for this transformation, the shift from the emphasis on the community to the emphasis on the individual. Now, the English Magna Carta would accelerate, and the implications of its ideas would grow far more rapidly in the Anglo or English diaspora than in England itself. So if you can make out England there, it's in the center of the map, the small islands there. Okay. What we want to bring into the story now is where the English would now transplant elements of English civilization. And part of the invisible cargo or the invisible value that was transplanted was the emphasis on the individual from things like the Magna Carta. That's what's transplanted as the English relocate to parts of North America. That's what's transplanted as the English relocate to to New Zealand and Australia in the Pacific. So remember, the story that we're trying to explain to someone outside of this class is how did we go from a society that emphasized the community where identity was largely given to one where now identity is largely chosen. And the way that now European expansion and exploration can help us to explain this is how some of these invisible ideas, more specifically, the emphasis on the individual, would be transplanted to different parts of the world. The New World options of Australia, Canada, and the United States allowed for more of the radical implications of the Magna Carta and the emphasis on the individual. See, those folks who left England, they were now far, far removed from the power of the community. More specifically, the power that we're referring to is the English monarchy and England's parliament. So it would be in the diaspora of Australia, Canada, and the United States that potentially the more radical implications of ideas like the Magna Carta could now be transplanted and come to fruition. In the case of the United States, we're going to have a chance to explore this in a bit more detail as we continue this story. But it would be here in the United States, as you can see from this image, with Western expansion. See, the further west you moved further and further away from established settlements. So if you chafed against what the community said you could or could not do, if you wanted to get away from a given identity, from what it was that you were given in this Eastern community, well, go west, young man. It would be in places like the United States of America that we would begin to see how individuals would now feel themselves empowered to now move away from the power of the community to limit identity choices, to now go west and claim new identities. So what we've tried to take a look at more collectively now is how in what we call the West or Western civilization, we begin to see this transition from the emphasis on the community to that of the individual. Again, this is not universal in origin. This is something very specific or in some ways even unique to the Western world. So as we see in this graphic, we see our little guy there in his boat taking this radical detour. While every other society and culture had emphasized the community, over the centuries, it would be in what we today call the West or Western civilization, we would see the emergence of the individual, of more choices of identity. So next time, as we continue this story, we're going to have an opportunity to explore how the American Revolution significantly contributes to this transition. Here, we're going to have a chance to see how now the American revolutionaries break free from the communal constraints of England to go in a new direction. Then we'll also bring it a little closer to our own time next time when we focus on how this pivotal decade in American history, the 1960s, and there you can see some representative faces. We get the Volkswagen van, the Beatles, going to the moon, Martin Luther King, etc. We'll also have a chance to see how this generation that came of age in the 1960s also went and contributed to this transition to greater identity choices. So again, as we bring this to this narrated PowerPoint to a close, my suggestion is that of Emily. Stay focused on the four things we have in front of us. So again, in discussion group, you're going to have an opportunity to develop your solo teaching moment. You're going to be teaching via Zoom, okay, on your identity variable. And you'll have an opportunity then to also collaborate with your teammates as you now team teach a Boise ethnic streetscape. So our next video, when we return, will continue to provide content for our second exam, and then you can anticipate that we'll also try to provide you greater context for the core identity project. So look forward to having you back next time. Once again, good luck in the four remaining tasks. And if you have questions, if there's a need for clarification, don't hesitate to reach out to either Emily or myself. Take care, stay safe and sane. And that's it for this segment of the History of Identity.